Welcome, this is Jim, host of the Faith Influencer podcast, where we're going to dive into discussions on faith's role in everyday life, from navigating blended families to overcoming challenges. I'm a husband, a father, a Bible teacher, an advocate for applying faith to everyday life. So tune in as I share personal stories, valuable insights, and practical wisdom. Welcome back to Faith Influencer. This is Jim Cunningham. We're talking about raising children. And in particular today, we're talking about raising children in a blended family. And I want to give you some things that I think will help you as we navigate this world of raising children in blended families. And by the way, let me say that this applies to everyone, whether you're a blended family or not. But I want to mention some specific things for blended families, since this is a blended family podcast. So there's this passage in the New Testament, in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6 and verse 4, and it's kind of a strange verse. It's in that passage that Paul, the writer of Ephesians, is talking about relationships, and he's talking about the home, and he's talking about the workplace, and having success, and what that should look like as a Christian. And so he's talking about how husbands and wives relate to each other. But then he talks about children, and he talks about how children relate to their parents in obedience. But then he talks about how parents ought to relate to their children, and he gives us this interesting verse. He says, "Parents, do not exasperate your children." Some translations say, "Parents, do not provoke your children to anger." I remember when I read that the first time many years ago, I'm like, what do we do as parents that provokes anger in our children? Well, if you don't dig into that, you're thinking, it really doesn't matter. I'm leading my children whether they like it or not. No, that's not what it's talking about. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about a parenting style that provokes anger in your children. It's talking about an inconsistency. It's talking about doing things that go against what God has designed as a parent that creates some issues with your children. So that's true in all families with all children, but especially in the blended family. In the blended family, the step-parent, which I'm a step-parent has to navigate this even more carefully, because as we've said before, a step-parent has a certain role in the family. Go listen to some earlier podcasts and we dive into that even more. But a step-parent has a particular role, and if you're not careful, the step-parent for sure can anger their children. So what does it mean, and how do we keep from angering our children, as Paul said in the Bible? So here we go. You have to understand the context. This was 2,000 years ago. It was in a city called Ephesus. And in that major city in Ephesus, the father, was the king. But he was more than just the king of the household. He literally, and you have to understand, this was a pagan city. He literally had life or death of his children in his hands. When a child was born in his family, let's say a son was born, in this pagan society in Ephesus, that son was brought and laid at the feet of his father. And his father could make a decision in that pagan society right then whether he wanted that son to live or to die. That's very pagan. By the way, we live in a society just like that, that's just as pagan, where we bring our children and decide whether we want them to live or to die. And if you know what I'm talking about, that's a scourge in our world today. That came from a pagan society 2,000 years ago. So what Paul says, writing in the context of this pagan society, Paul says, parents, I don't want you to provoke or exasperate your children. I want you to raise your children like this. So let's walk through what he says. I recently read a study by a Christian psychiatrist. Look him up. Dr. Paul Meir. He did this fantastic study from a Christian perspective on raising children. I want to give you some of the points that he mentioned in his study. He first laid out what a good parent-child relationship looks like. And he said two things. A good parent-child relationship consists of the love of the parents for each other, talking about the mom and the dad love each other, the husband and wife love each other. You've heard me say in the past, that's the foundation of a strong family. And then he said, the love of the parent for their children. That's what Paul's getting into here, how to love your child and not provoke them to anger. So he said, that's the foundation, loving each other and loving your children. So how are we to have a healthy parenting relationship with our children? What is Paul trying to tell us here? So let me give you several things. Dr. Meir said, first of all, there must be firm and consistent discipline. Now, one of the motivations for me as a parent and as a step-parent is that I understand that the root word for discipline is disciple. I'm raising disciples. That's what I'm doing. I'm raising disciples. I love that role of raising disciples. I love directing and training my children to be disciples of the Lord, disciples and followers of what's right. We're raising disciples, but that creates for us the need to be firm and consistent. If there's one thing that I see in parenting is that's a problem, is the lack of consistency. It's the parent who shares with their child this value, and then they break the value themselves. Is they tell their child not to do this, shouldn't ever do this, and then do it themselves. In my family, if you go back to generations, there was this scourge of alcoholism. And that was passed down to generations. And when my father saw his father and his brother and his sister, their lives ruined to the point of death by alcoholism, he said to our family, he said, that's not going to be a part of our family. But he didn't just say that. He went to the kitchen, took 2 bottles of wine. I was a kid. I was a young kid, but I still remember it. Poured them down the sink, threw them away, and said, it will never be in our house again. And you know what? It never was. So it wasn't just a value and a conviction that he now had, that he told us not to do that because it's a family curse, but he lived it. He actually did it himself. Well, what happens is parents have this conviction, but not strong enough to go by it themselves. So what Dr. Meir says is that if you've got some values and convictions, you can't just say them, you got to live them if they're going to be important to your family. You've got to provide this right example. For me, I love the role that I'm in as a husband, as a father, and as a stepfather. Because for me, I've got 2 big priorities. One is to love Jesus with all my heart, and the best thing for my children is to love my wife. That's the 2 big roles that I have. You say, well, what about parenting? Yeah, that's number 3. But it's not number 2, and it's not number 1. It's number 3. And for your children to see that structure creates stability for them. Dr. Meir goes on. He says that neurotics in our society is off the charts. But in all of the studies, and listen, if you want to throw something at me for what I'm about to say, go ahead, but really throw it at Dr. Meir because he's the one who did the study, that the study shows that the majority of neurotics in our country have grown up in either a home where there was no father or in a home where the mother dominated the father. Studies show that has created issues with the children who grow up in those homes. Now, in saying that, there are single mothers out there who says, well, what does that say to me? It says to me that you have a difficult role of being both. If you're not married and you have children and you're a single mother and your children, you hear what I just said and you're like, no, this is what you do. Have a man in their life. I know that you're not married now, and that's difficult, but have a man in their life, your father or a grandfather or a man at church, someone who could be a part of their life and give them a male influence. So that right example. Let's keep going. So the next thing, as we raise children in our family, that becomes a difficult or becomes an issue, Dr. Meir says, is overprotection. Now, we call this the helicopter parent. How many of you out there, just raise your hands, I'll see you through the camera. How many of you out there are overprotective? How many of you out there are helicopter parents? Now, I'm kind of raising my hand because I can lean that way. I can easily be the overprotective parent. Do you want to know who the overprotective parent is? Go to a basketball game and listen to the dad in the stands who's yelling at the top of his voice because his son got fouled or something happened, and everybody in the whole place is wondering, who is that dad? That's that overprotective dad, while his kid crawls under a chair because he's embarrassed because his dad can't take care of himself. So there's that overprotection. Well-meaning, Dr. Meir says, though, if you're an overprotective helicopter parent, you're going to cause resentment in your children. Bottom line. If you're overprotective helicopter parent, you're going to cause resentment. You smother your children. You become overly strict. You don't trust them, and they become resentful of that, even though you're saying, I just love them. No, if you really look into it, you love yourself too much to allow them to be and grow up in the way that God has made them. It's you that you love. It's your feelings that you're more concerned about, not their feelings. So let's put that in order. Here's the next one. And this is a big one. We see this in Scripture all the time when you read through the Old Testament. He says that the next thing that can really frustrate raising our children and become an issue is favoritism. Favoritism. Do you remember that Old Testament story where you had Isaac, who favored his son Esau over his son Jacob, and you had Rebekah, the mother, who favored Jacob over Esau? That was favoritism to the max. Do you know what that favoritism did, by the way? If you have favoritism in your family, you know what that does? It not only affected their immediate family, but their descendants. It was something that affected their children and their children's children on down. It kept going. I've seen this. Let me give you a personal example. For years, I was a pastor, and I've done so many different funerals. But I could always tell when there was this division in the family because let's say a mother or a father died and all the children gathered together. I'm talking about grown children. All of them gathered together in the home, and I meet with them, and we're talking about the funeral service, and we're going over all of the details. I could always tell when one parent favored these kids and another parent favored these kids because there's a division amongst the children. So here's what happens, and I want you to understand this is what's going to happen if you are a parent who shows a child favoritism. Here's what happens. When you see favoritism by parents, you'll begin to see the favoritism of a child for a parent. Let me say it again. If you are a parent who favors a child, your children are going to do the same thing, and they're going to begin to have favoritism towards a particular parent. I know that's not what you want in your family, but that's what you're creating if you're showing favoritism. So favoritism has to go. We love our children the same, and we show them that the same. Blended family. Back to blended family. Step parent. You're going to love your biological child more than you love your stepchildren. Fact. Like it or not, fact. But that doesn't mean that you show favoritism towards your biological child over the other child. You have to fight against that. That's going to be your tendency, I can tell you already, and I know because I've been there. That's going to be your tendency is to show favoritism over your child, or your tendency is going to be to pull your biological child aside and say, hey, I'm going to do this, but don't tell your stepbrother or your stepsister that I did this for you. No, you can't create that kind of atmosphere of favoritism. It's going to affect generations, and we see that in Scripture. Here's the next one. Oh, this one I hate. It's comparison. It's where you compare one child against the other child. Your brother never does that. Your sister never talks back to me. Look how organized your sister is. Look how clean your brother's room is. Can you see that your brother is an incredible athlete? It's this whole comparison thing. This comparison thing, you know what it does? It breaks the will of a child. When you compare one against the other, that child wants to quit trying. I felt that a little bit growing up. My parents were amazing. I'm not gonna say they showed favoritism because they didn't. But my brother, who was that pioneer personality who always had to win, my brother always was the one who was recognized for his achievements in athletics, in school, all of that. And that was always put front and center because it's obvious the parents want to recognize that. But if you do that and don't recognize things from the other child, then that child begins to not want to try. That child begins to get discouraged. That child may even begin to withdraw or to become bitter. So you want to be careful about comparing. And so look at your own household and ask yourself that question. Are you showing more towards one child over the other child? Let me give it to you in a different way. And this way hurts a little bit. Listen to what unfortunately is happening way too often, and it even skews our view of God. Some parents catch themselves in what I call a trap, and it's this trap of comparison, but it's also this trap of performance. So call it the performance trap. And the performance trap is where you show more affection or love towards the child who performs like you want them to perform. So what happens with that child is they begin to think that you love them more when they're good and you love them less when they're not as good. And then you know what that child thinks when they become an adult? That I have to perform for my Heavenly Father for Him to love me more. That is such a skewed view of God. God is not like that at all. But if you raise your children like that, you love them more when they're good and less when they're not as good, then you're creating this skewed view called the performance trap. We love our kids. Listen, if my kid is good, I love him. If my kid is rebelling, I love him the same because my love for him is not dependent upon his behavior. And it's the same with God. Last thing. Dr. Meir says is failing to allow children to grow up at a normal pace. Now, unfortunately, this sometimes is unavoidable. I have a young man in my office, and I say young man, he's in his late 20s, and he's telling me his story the other day that when he was basically 12 years old, he had to take on the father role in his household. That his father had left, his mother couldn't handle it, and he literally had to begin earning money to help provide for the family. That's way too young at 12 years old for someone to have to take on that role. Sometimes out of necessity, and that was his case. Does it affect him today? Yeah, it does. But sometimes parents aren't in that situation, but they still try to push their children through childhood faster than their normal development. Dr. Meir says, let them grow up and be children while they're children. Let your kids laugh and have fun and act up and do silly things. They're children. They're not adults. Let them grow up at their normal pace. Thank you, Dr. Meir, for those words of wisdom. Thank you for joining us. I hope that helps today as we just navigate the world of raising our children. What a joy to do that. But let's step up our game as parents. As always, like our podcast, go on to YouTube and subscribe and tell other people about what we're doing. We have this ministry to parents of blended families, and we want to make the strong blended family more successful. Again, this is Jim Cunningham. Thank you for joining us.